Ready, Janie? We've all... Okay. Okay, well, good morning and welcome, and I'll declare the council meeting for Monday, 4 September open. If I can have, as you can see, our chair is not available today, and if I can have a mover and seconder for appointment of chair for this meeting. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Stephen. Second by Shad. There's no further discussion. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Shad, in terms of opening karakia. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Bill. I whakahaere nei tēnei o tō tātou nei hui. Me kira kia tātou katoa kua tau nei tēnei ata. Kia kōrua tahi ngā mema o te hāpuri, tēnā kōrua, tēnā tātou katoa. Just want to acknowledge you, Bill, for chairing our meeting today in Anne's absence, and also our couple of members of the public here this morning, and also to our staff. Just before I do start, I do want to acknowledge the passing of Rodney, and I think Bill will make some comments as well. Rodney Nicholas, and I understand our staff went out there on Wednesday to attend the tangi out in Whakamarama, and I went out there for the funeral on Thursday to spend time with the family. So just our condolences to them and to his whānau. Nō re, he te rangatira, haere atu rā, hoki atu rā ki o mātua ki o tūpuna. So we'll just open with a short karakia. Nō re, kia nui tātou. E te atua anea nō rā mātou e huitahi nei tēnei ata, ka tuku ngā reo whakamoimiti ngā reo whakawhiatai ki a koe, maumana ki tanga katoa. A toro mai rā tōringa kaha ki runga ki tēnā o mātou, he āwhina he tōru tō nei i a mātou ratu i nei mahi. Nō re te atua tēnei mātou tēnei ki a koe, korore ki tōringa tapu. Āmeni.
Kia ora, Shad. So, yes, I'd just like to acknowledge the passing of Rodney Nicholas. I understand he'd been a staff member for about 8 years, and was part of the network operations team, and also had a great depth of knowledge and understanding in terms of road surfacing and marking. And in terms of, I further understand he wasn't someone who pushed himself forward, but clearly in terms of his colleagues, a conversation with Rodney was always well worthwhile in terms of that depth of knowledge that he actually brought to the role. So I'd just like to acknowledge and our condolences to his family, and our thoughts are with the whānau and family at this time. So, welcome to this meeting, and we have an apology from Commission Chair Anne, so I'm happy to move receipt of that apology, seconded by Stephen. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So we'll now move to the public forum, and like to welcome Emma Jones, who's coming to speak about the Te Whara Ora Health Report in respect of air quality at Mount Maunganui. So welcome, Emma. You have up to 5 minutes to speak, including any time for questions. So if you push the button in front of you so it's green, and over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for granting me this time to come and talk to you. it's nice to look around the table and see some familiar faces because it's quite daunting sitting here. So the reason first to introduce myself, Emma Jones, I represent a community group called Clear the Air, Mount Maunganui, which was set up several years ago to really unify the voices predominantly in the Mount, which have been really fighting for improvements in our air quality for decades, if not generations. So we started a group to really just put some structure around that and to be able to lobby for an improvement. As you know, many of you are aware, we have the worst air quality in the country. We're downwind from an industrial area which has a lot of heavy industry that emit air, and we have a lot of vulnerable sites bordering this industrial area, including 3 schools with thousands and thousands of children, less than 100-300 meters away. So that's why I'm here, and you're probably, and the reason I wanted to come to this public forum for the TCC as well is we've recently had a health report, and we've been waiting years for, which I just want to make sure that this doesn't go by the wayside. It's a really important piece of research that, like any kind of data and that is around air pollution, is really does take a long time, and so we have been waiting a long time for this. And the health report does have very clear conclusions about the level of contaminants in our air and the chronic risk to the community. And once again, you're probably thinking, why aren't I talking to the regional council, because they deal with air quality? However, a lot of these activities are happening on TCC land, and we as an organisation feel that the duty of care is on the TCC to protect the community and do everything they can within their powers, and perhaps lobby for having more powers to protect the community. So the reason I wanted to come today is to ask, I guess, to make sure that this health report is on everyone's radar, which is the air pollution health risk assessment carried out by the ESR, to make sure that everyone has read the report, and that your decisions going forward will be informed by the results of this report. Like, to be honest, the report is probably a best case scenario because a lot of the monitoring was limited to things like PM10, which is pretty much dust, and there are a lot of other contaminants such as benzene, which is a known carcinogenic chemical, which is not being monitored. So we think that this health report, which has very clear conclusions, is still pretty damning as to the impacts on the community. So have you read the report? Is it being used to inform decisions that you will be making around the spatial plan? Are you intending to discuss with central government ways around the RMA and the existing use rights that some of these factories have, given now that we have this information about the harmful effects of their activities on TCC land? So what levers can you use with the central government to work towards, I guess, making sure that they're not just going back to hiding behind existing legislation? We know central government can change legislation. They've done that with COVID. They can do it with some pressure, especially when we know that our communities are at risk. So there's those couple of questions, and then I guess finally, yes, will you be using this report to inform the spatial plan? I think I just mentioned. And then just finally, the burden has been on the community for decades to prove harm, to complain about harm, to try to lobby for change. So we'd like the burden shifted to the industries. We'd like you to be speaking to the heads of these industries, to the boards of directors, to make sure that this report and the impacts of their activities on our local community are known to these industries that are operating on your land, our land, and that they're aware that the board of directors are aware that we'll be holding them to account if they can continue to involuntarily just carry on activities as they are doing. We'd like them to bear more of the burden of improving things in Mount Maunganui. And just to wrap up, that this is all coming from a place of concern and worry for our children, for the mana whenua surrounded by heavy industry at Whareroa that have been subjected to, generations of harmful chemical contaminants in their air, the schools that are bordering without a proper buffer zone. So this is coming from a place of just wanting to make sure our community is protected. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I'd just like I'll make a couple of comments. There are a number of matters that you've raised, which are better responded given the constraints of the public forum with you and your group. So certainly able to come back in terms of a number of those matters. I would like to make a couple of points though in terms of engagement and the involvement with the Mount spatial planning work, and there's also underway what is called a Mount Industrial Planning Study. And the report, in terms of that health report in particular, will be feeding in terms of that Mount Industrial Planning Study, which we will get to consider by the end of this calendar year. Okay, and can you guarantee that the interests of industry will not be prioritised over the interests of the community? I cannot guarantee anything at this point in time because that work is a work in progress. What is in that will be presented to us. So we need to work through all that given the range of parties that are involved. But we are mindful of all the obligations of parties given the nature of the concerns that are outlined. Thank you. And it's just like we feel that this is such an... Yeah, we're getting a bit beyond. We're starting to have a conversation. Yeah, no, fair enough. But more than happy in terms, and particularly Shad and I engaging, given we're on the Mount Air Quality Working Party outside of this meeting to work through a number of those matters. Shad, do you have a question or comment?
Sorry, probably just a comment for Bill. I think it'd be worth the four commissioners, so not just Bill and I having that conversation with the Air group, actually having the four commissioners available to have this conversation, I think would be helpful rather than just Bill and I.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. Now we'll move on to the next item, which is the acceptance of late items. And we have one in terms of the public excluded section relating to the appointment of the chief executive. So thanks, Stephen. Second by Shad. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Now, also in terms of, just for clarification, on our agenda, you'll notice under business, there is no 11.3, but within the agenda there is, which relates to the Te Papa local development contribution proposals. So we do have that report, and it was part of the agenda, and a copy had been also circulated separately. Both of the reports are the same. So I just wanted to clarify that point. And also noting the reason for accepting that late item is that related to matters regarding the appointment received after the agenda closed. Okay, item 5, is there any confidential business to be transferred into open? I haven't been advised of any. We'll move on. There is no change to the order of business as per the agenda. So we'll move to item 7.1, the confirmation of minutes of our 14 August meeting 2023, commencing on page 10 of the agenda. Are there any matters commissioners wish to raise in respect of those minutes? Chad.
Thanks, Chair. Just a comment, I'm just scrolling through. We did have the presentation by the TAF, the Toxic
Agricultural Chemicals Advisory Forum.
And they presented in the public forum, and we did make a number of comments. I think Anne made a number of comments that they should have been part of the when staff reported to us and not in the public forum. I just want that noted to make sure that that doesn't occur in the future.
Noted in today's minutes.
Yes.
Okay. No, thank you. No further, Stephen. Well, we're not going to amend the minutes. We're just going to note them for today's minutes here. Yep. So you've moved.
Yep.
Second by Shad. If there's nothing further, I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So we'll now move. Are there any declarations of interest in respect of matters on the agenda? No. There are no deputations, petitions or presentations. So we'll move to item 10, recommendations from other committees, and that's on page 38 of the agenda. And that's relating to a recommendation from the Tauranga Public Transport Joint Committee and amendments to the terms of reference. So there's a recommendation there to have additional non-voting members in respect of Waka Kotahi representation. Stephen. Oh, sorry.
Ollie's going to speak.
So I was getting carried away, Ollie. Over to you.
Through the chair, I'm happy to take the report as read unless there are any questions.
Okay. Questions?
Yeah, I'm very happy to move this. I think it would be very valuable to have Waka Kotahi as a co-member of that committee. It is intended that the committee is a joined up body looking at public transport, and since Waka Kotahi are a significant funder as well as advisor on those matters, I think they should be involved, and happy to move the recommendations as they stand.
Okay. Second by Shad. There's nothing further. I'll put those recommendations. All in favour? Against? Carried. Thanks very much, Jonathan. We'll move now to 11.1, which is the annual plan 23-24 revised capital projects commencing on page 43. Okay. Welcome.
Morning. Thank you. So this report, we're seeking approval to revise the capital budgets that were set out in the 2024 annual plan to factor in those carry forwards of unspent budget from last financial year and to align with the capital priorities that we've recently drafted in the 24-34 long-term plan. So last financial year, we achieved capital expenditure of around 300 million, meaning a total carry forward of 145 million has been requested. And this is really a reflection of a very challenging and ambitious program of works that we're delivering on. Many programs now being made up of complex multi-year projects. So in the most part, this is just a rephasing exercise between financial years. As you'll see in attachment A, rather than just picking up this carry forward amount and throwing it on top of our already large 2024 annual plan program, we've worked with the business to rephase the timing of this spend across this financial year and future years, keeping deliverability, affordability and disruption to the community in mind. This would see an increase from a net capital budget of 367 million in the adopted annual plan to a revised budget of 451 million. In attachment B, you'll see that within the budget adjustments, there are some new project budgets or additional budgets being requested. Now, some of these have already come through separate council papers or will be presented today, being the park and ride trial of 3.2 million and the replacement fire truck at the airport, 540,000 in this current financial year. Hopefully those attachments have provided you with enough detail, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. It was just a process question. Given we'll be considering some of the matters further on the agenda, can we resolve on this matter now or just leave it on the table and come back until we've considered those other matters? Yeah, for example, the park and ride.
Fire truck is the other one, so yes, it might be.
I guess I have put in that attachment that those two budgets are subject to approval later today. So, yeah.
Safe to leave it on the table just to confirm.
So do I just receive?
Yeah, just receive.
Yep. Okay. No, thank you. But certainly any questions at this point in time? Don't appear to be any. So mover and seconder then for A, to receive the report. Stephen, second by Shad. There's nothing further. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. And then we'll come back once we've considered those other reports. Thank you. So we'll move to item 11.2. Long-term plan, the funding, the backlog of development contribution funded projects. And that commences on page 49. Fraser, welcome.
So I guess just development contributions, it's a very significant source of revenue for council, I think just behind water meter revenue. We have generally been pretty successful in terms of charging and collecting development contributions over the years, but the legislation has, I guess, some restrictions, and our ability to estimate the future perfectly is also not always there. So we have over time collected a bit less than we would have if we'd had perfect knowledge. And really this paper is about trying to identify that under collection, and rather than dump it all on the future ratepayers, is actually do something about it in an organised basis. We have been looking at this for several years, and we have been running a process where we've over time been transferring developer contribution funded debt to ratepayer funded debt. So over time that would then be funded off through general rates. We've actually looked at a slight change of tack in this report in terms of actually trying to say, well, there were certain areas where the majority of this backlog was generated in terms of it's relating to local infrastructure, so it's specifically relating to an area. And we're just sort of saying, should we now start look at, while still collecting half of that from the general public, should we also look at actually charging that area directly for part of that fee?
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of comments first. In terms of, and this relates to the recommendation B, because it refers to the principles which are in paragraph 20, and we'll come to it when we come to the recommendation themselves, but that those points A to E part of the recommendation under B. So there's clear understanding in terms of what those principles are. And the other thing, given the concern raised about the current legislation, etc., probably it's a good topic in terms of then raising in our briefing paper to incoming ministers. in terms of the concerns about the constraints of the legislation. So just noting that. And related to that, in terms of the backlog, one of the questions is, does it ever end, given those constraints? I get the sense it just carries on and on and on. Christine.
And so you're right, no, it doesn't end because you can never get it 100% accurate. But I think the thing that we do in Tauranga, and I think we're the only council in New Zealand who does this, is we do actually track it and we transparently disclose it and transparently transfer it to rate funded debt, whereas most other councils, it's just sitting in a mass. You don't know about it.
Just my last question at this point, on page 62, and this is the background paper attachment A, down the bottom there are 3 bullet points. Second to last one, it says, not all projects been included in the initial structure plan. My question is, that was at a point in time, are we getting better and addressing that type of issue in terms of subsequent structure planning work?
Yes, we are, and I think as noted in the report, we're actually asking the developers to do most of these anyway now, so that some of the quantum of what we're collecting through DCs is getting less and less, specifically where there's that sort of the level of detail that sits in the structure plan that is harder to get accurate, whereas we're tending to now fund only those much larger trunk mains.
No, thank you. Open it for questions. Shad, and then Stephen.
Thank you. I've just got para 18 in 2021-22 talks about council reviewed this backlog, and there was 23 million sitting in there. In terms of the conversations with council at that time, did they consider this type of approach to a targeted rate to collect? And if it was raised, what were some of the concerns by previous council and why they didn't adopt that kind of thinking or approach?
No, it wasn't actually considered at that stage. So this is something we've looked at and brought to yourselves as a new decision.
Okay, so just a follow-up question to that. In terms of other local authorities, and Christine mentioned, we seem to be tracking it well, and others may not be tracking it. Are others about other similar types of approaches, or are other councils applied this type of approach?
No. It's generally if you talk to people from other councils, they generally acknowledge, yes, that's a problem, but they have no idea what the quantum is of the problem, and therefore they haven't actually kind of specifically been able to do anything about it.
I mean, I'm comfortable with the principles and the approach to recovery. I think that's probably the important thing, is that trying to find an equitable mechanism to recover the debt, and in particular those that benefit. So these communities where these costs have been incurred should have paid it. So if we had done the assessments well in the first instance, we could have recovered more. But I'm comfortable with the approach in terms of trying to recover that backlog from communities where the infrastructure was provided in the first instance. I suppose my other question is, and it goes through in the report about the split between what should be provided by those communities that directly benefit, and then also potentially the balance being covered by the general ratepayer. So it would be useful to understand, your thinking. I mean, it's in the report, but it would be quite good to hear your thinking about how we manage that equity conversation across the community.
It's a very difficult conversation. Either way, you are correct in terms of, well, first of all, at the end of the day, someone has to pay for that shortfall, and there will always be winners and losers in terms of that. We have tried to look at that and sort of say, well, it's probably fairer that the people in the particular area that have the infrastructure probably should pay a bit more, and which is why we've moved to that approach. from where we've been in the past, and potentially whether that is a philosophical sort of slight change in direction for council as a whole. In the past, we've probably tended to fund things mostly across the city. This is kind of a slight change in direction, and I think there might be another report or two coming relatively soon that might have a similar direction. What we're just trying to do is put it in front of yourselves, and you can make a decision on that. And this is where we feel it's not for staff to make this sort of call. This is something for the commissioners and the community to make this call about how this sort of thing is resolved.
Stephen.
Yeah, I support the recommendations, and am happy to move them, Chair. But recognising that this is a grey area, had we had perfect knowledge, it's clear that the community would have been charged directly, but we didn't have that knowledge. To put it across as a burden now seems going too far in terms of the impact on those communities. And so we're seeking to achieve a balance here between getting a fairer allocation to the communities that have benefited versus imposing all of that cost on the ratepayer generally, but recognising that it's not clear cut. And so that's the reason why the other 50% might be carried by ratepayers. I think this is a fair compromise, and is certainly consistent with the direction that the Commission has taken, which is very much around trying to allocate rates on a fair share basis as best one can. It's not a perfect science, as we know, but this seems to me to be fairer than requiring all ratepayers to carry this backlog. So, Chair, happy to move the recommendation.
Okay, just before I come to that, I just had one further question. So, given there is that, there will always be under the current legislative framework some shortfall. In terms of setting development contributions, is there any way to recognise that shortfall, and then that shortfall is picked up through the DC process?
No, the way the legislation is written, you can't. So we do what we can in terms of making sure we use inflation-proof numbers. We do charge cost of capital, so they were changes that we've made in previous years, and those changes, per our legal advice, are consistent and able to be levied under the legislation. But putting in a buffer for accuracy of assumptions, particularly in respect of yield or cost overruns beyond the contingency that you'd normally build in your budgets, you can't do. You must have alignment between the capital project costs that you have in your LTP and the capital project costs that you have in your development contributions policy. So, no, we have explored that, and we have raised it previously in terms of submissions to central government on some of these factors, but to date they haven't been accepted.
Okay, no, thank you. And probably just a comment before we come to the recommendations. Whilst there is a principle that growth pays for growth, in part, that principle is aspirational given the matters that we are dealing with here. So I think it's just being clear about that, because I think there are some, when they see that growth pays for all the growth, will know there is a component that, whether it's targeted rate or general rates or whatever, that is rate funded. Okay, so Stephen, you've moved, and are you happy to move with the addition of those principles in paragraph 20? And there are 5 there that relate to the certainty the shortfall is permanent, the amount of the shortfall is known and certain, projects that the shortfall relates to have been completed, the amount that is transferred is treated like any other rate-funded project, etc., and elected members have approved the transfer. Okay. Second by Shad. There's nothing further. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Thanks, Fraser. We now move to 11.3, and this is the item that I referenced earlier that wasn't on the agenda contents list, but is in the agenda. Te Papa Local Development Contribution Catchment Report. And we've got Ben and Andy. So welcome, guys.
Good morning. We just have a little extra material that's been prepared in relation to this report that will be circulated that Ben will speak to in a moment. I'll just give a quick introduction and then I'll let Ben speak to the additional work that we've done. This report relates to the Te Papa Peninsula, which is a significant intensification growth area identified through our Te Papa Spatial Plan and being implemented in terms of zoning through Plan Change 33, which is well advanced. There is a significant, I guess, investment in infrastructure program to support the existing community and growth in Te Papa across all the activities that council leads. What we've been doing is considering whether development contributions could be utilised as one of a number of funding sources to assist delivery of that investment program. And this report addresses that matter. In terms of, I guess, the direction of the report, it identifies that in the transport and reserves activities, there are some opportunities to utilise development contributions. However, in the three waters activities, that is more challenging. The obvious issue there is the assumptions around the LTP in terms of waters being out after the end of year 2, with the establishment of water service entities. The stormwater activity, again, is also quite challenging, even if that issue didn't exist, because of the fragmented nature of the stormwater activity. There's over 20, probably close to 30 sub-catchments in Te Papa. We will only be investing in a small number of those, and therefore it's hard to have a charge across the whole growth area, as not everyone will benefit from that investment, and significant benefits accrue to existing property owners where flooding is removed, even if they are not developing. So obviously one of the issues to consider is that a development contribution will increase development costs and therefore make development more expensive, working against the affordability of housing and those sort of aspects as well. But it will, I guess, sheet the cost back to those that benefit. So there's that balance to be struck in terms of those particular matters. So just quickly in terms of reserves and transport, I guess the key issue is, you know, how do we get to a charge, and the cost allocation approach that we've adopted, which is an interim approach that we will review further between the draft LTP and DC policy and the final being adopted. It recognises both the benefits to growth, but also the benefits to the existing community in Te Papa, which is a large established community. And in terms of transport, also recognising that a number of the projects in there, particularly the Cameron Road multimodal project, provides even wider benefits beyond Te Papa to the whole city, and that is recognised through the citywide IFF charge for transport that we have established. So we have landed through our methodology that around 20% of the costs of the reserves, which is a neighbourhood reserves development program, and the transport projects would be appropriate to fund through development contributions in Te Papa. Just turn it over to Ben now to just go through the additional work that he's completed.
Morning. So as Andy said, the funding for transport and reserves through a local DC would raise about, or is proposed to raise about $28 million in local DC funding. Those projects are sitting in the LTP anyway, and they already had funding sources allocated to them, so that creates sort of a displacement effect. That displacement is hitting in two places, which is rates funding or loans funded by rates, and and the IFF. The rates question is sort of relatively simple. It creates a positive impact on rates by decreasing them by shifting the funding to the other funding source, DCs. For IFF, it's a little more complex. When we implemented the IFF, we had to set a drawdown profile for the financier. That profile was based on planning at the time. We knew it probably was a little ambitious. Through the LTP prioritisation process, that's initially been pushed back based on what it looks like now by about 6 months to September 2027. By creating this further displacement through the transport projects, it pushes it back a further 9 months to the middle of 2027. We'll continue to do work to see how we can minimise that impact. That'll be through either increased costs on eligible projects within the existing drawdown timeline. That'll be the primary way of trying to solve it, and then whether we can sort of moderate the capital profile for other projects to ensure that we're drawing down the IFF as quickly as possible. So those are probably the macro funding considerations. In terms of on a development by development level, currently we're estimating a local DC for a 3+ bedroom property at 8,500. So that's sort of at an absolute level. We currently charge local DCs between nothing and 43,000. 8.5 obviously sits towards the bottom end. However, if we were looking more at like the profile of local DCs, it sort of sits about right. Yeah, what I'm trying to say is 43,000 is quite high. Looking across the city, 8 is still relatively low compared to other local catchments. So that's for residential. For non-residential, we charge on a different basis. It's per 100 square metres, and there we're looking at a similar sort of number per 100 square metres, 8,200. That's still built on a couple of assumptions that we're going to refine before we would implement the DC policy. The first one is around those financing costs. If you're looking at the material table this morning, second to right column has pretty substantial amounts sitting in there for financing. That relates to the inflation until the project's delivered, and then the debt holding costs thereafter while we go about collecting the DCs. We're still working on that work. We run a model for all of our DCs. These projects being pushed through. It was just a little tight. The other one is, as Andy suggested, these projects have both a residential and a non-residential benefit, and we're refining the way that we've allocated the cost between those. At the moment, it's worked up based on the amount of growth we expect to see in each place. We'd like to sort of strengthen that before we implement it. And that will sort of create some tweaks around the edges. But these are broadly the numbers that we'd expect to come out within our draft DC policy for consultation. That's all from me. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Chad.
Thank you. Thank you for the paper. And yeah, I think one of the, we've been talking about, and even in the last conversation we had about trying to get kind of fairness in the system, equity in the system, and understanding who benefits and who pays. And given, we've got a significant program across the Te Peninsula to increase density over time, and therefore, more people, more dwellings, more development. We do need to think about how we collect and fund the infrastructure required to enable that development. So I'm really comfortable with the approach that we've taken here, and I think it's more targeted, to be fair. So thinking about in the current system, we've got IFF spread right across the city, and everybody's paying in some way. But actually splitting it and targeting those that benefit, I think is a fairer way to allocate those costs, similar to the conversation we had earlier about the DC backlog. I don't really have a question. I'm just, the paper was pretty clear about the approach and what we're trying to do. across Te Papa. And it comes back to that the Commissioner's thinking about fairness, about cost allocation, and about how we fund what the city needs, essentially. So whether that's through DCs, through fees and charges, through rates, through the adjustments and for commercial to industrial to residential. I mean, this is just another way of trying to allocate some of that cost to those that benefit more in the system. More of a general comment, I think.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. And I support Shad's comments because it is totally consistent with our direction to get a fairer balance. I am concerned, though, about the impact on IFF, and I do think that this raises a key question about how can we ensure that we meet the timetables on IFF, because I'd hate us to be incurring additional costs on the basis that we couldn't. And so it kind of goes to the earlier item on the agenda about shifting our CapEx program, etc. The undesirable, whilst we have the necessity of that, the undesirability of it sheets home when you see this sort of impact. So it goes to the core of the question: how can we gear ourselves to make sure that we have the capacity to deliver on our program? And I know that's top of mind for the staff, but I really want to underline the criticality of that. This is a clear example of the adverse impact of delays, particularly on IFF, and to the extent that we can accelerate IFF projects to meet the borrowing profile, I think that has to be a priority. But with those comments, I'm happy to move the recommendation. It's a recommendation to consult after all, so I think it's the right proper thing to do, and we'll hear the views of both those for and against, no doubt.
Just before I presume you're seconding, Shad, one comment in terms of given it's a proposition for a new contribution arrangement, I just wanted some understanding of the thinking around engagement with the building and development sector, because in past experience, some of these initiatives can get lost in the overall LTP process. So it was just ensuring it didn't come as a surprise and that they're clear on the opportunities they have to feed into the consultation process. Am I looking at Ben?
Yeah, so I presented this initial idea to the Development Sector Forum, it must have been about 2 months ago now, and we agreed that I'll attend the next one, which I believe is later this month, and put this sort of thinking before them. This will then be wrapped up in a package of proposed DC policy amendments, which we're coming back to you on the 25th of this month, and that will then go out for consultation. So we know that DC consultation is difficult. It's hard to get meaningful conversations because it's tricky and people's eyes glaze over, basically. So we'll primarily look to target our consultation through that Development Sector Forum. So we're speaking to the bigger developers in the city. And it'll also be pushed out alongside our long-term plan consultation later this year to ensure that we are getting broad coverage across the city. But we do expect the sort of meaningful engagement to come from those personal conversations at a staff level. And then I think that we can definitely explore how we ensure that people will want to talk to the commissioners about these topics, and so we can make sure those conversations happen as well.
Just following on from that, Ben, probably one of my concerns based on, again, that previous experience was ensuring that building companies, etc., who are not part necessarily of that development sector arrangement, are well apprised of what's proposed, because we very clearly got it in terms of contractual obligations and all of that, and a surprise in terms of the increase. What was it, 2 years ago? So it was just making sure we cast that net wider than just that development sector for.
One thing to add, actually, that we did in over the last couple of years is push through our existing email channels as well. So we have a toolbox and a pānui that goes out to that group. And last year we also tracked through. You can sort of see how many people are opening the email, what links they're clicking through to on that, and how many people we're receiving onto our DC page. And so we can kind of broadly track how many eyeballs are actually looking at this information. And that's how we know that it's not a lot.
Thank you on that. And my final comment, and it was picking up Stephen's point of us clearly understanding any implications around any IFF drawdown in terms of changes to a capital program delivery and all of that and what those implications are. So it was really just making sure that the Commission are well apprised of that also into the future. Paul.
Just to comment on that, so we are adding into our regular reporting to strategy, finance and risk how IFF TSP projects are tracking.
Right, thank you. So Stephen, you had moved recommendations on page 76 from A to D. Second by Shad. There's no further discussion. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Ben. And we'll move on to the next one, which you're both waiting for. Yes. Item 11.4 commences on page 82, City Centre Development Contribution Incentives. Andy.
Yeah, all right. This is a pretty brief report. It's centered around whether or not we should consult as part of the draft upcoming long-term plan on development contribution incentives in the city centre area. And the rationale around doing that would be looking to support the large investment program in the city centre that the council has and other public agencies have, and looking to optimise that through private development outcomes. We know that development is challenging at the moment from a private sector perspective, and getting the numbers to add up, getting finance in place. We know there's limited amount of things that council can do to control that, but development contributions is one of those things, and other councils are doing that. For example, Hamilton City Council. So this isn't actually suggesting that any money is put in the draft annual plan at this stage to fund development contributions in the city centre, but that could be a potential outcome following consultation. Obviously, there is the ratepayer impact to consider, as costs would then be transferred to the ratepayer. There are a range of considerations that are outlined in the report. That's perhaps only some of the considerations about how a fund might be structured in terms of what type of development we're looking at, smaller or larger developments, residential or non-residential developments, the whole development contribution or only part of the development contribution, those sorts of aspects, and those are all things that can be consulted on. We also understand that the development sector have other ideas about how the council may be able to support redevelopment of the city centre, because not all redevelopment will attract development contributions. For example, rebuilding of earthquake-prone buildings into a similar kind of two-storey building that exists already won't attract development contributions, as there's no increase in gross floor area. So there's some aspects in that regard that we understand submissions might be made on if it was to proceed. What you have in terms of the additional handout, it also addresses this item, and this is just to provide some context around the scale of development contributions. So you can see on the second page, there are a range of development. These are just example developments. So the first table covers residential development, a 2, a 6 and a 10-storey building with various numbers of apartments. And you can see through that the development contribution could be anywhere between 200 and sort of $2 million. So $2 million for a large 50-unit apartment building. We've just indicatively suggested there might be an incentive on that one, but that's all subject to the consultation process and final decisions. And then the second table addresses the non-residential development, so like an office retail type building. You can see for a smaller development, charges are again in that sort of $200,000 scale, but for a large building with a large amount of growth floor area, that charge is getting up towards $1 million. I think then these calculations include the proposed Te Papa development contribution charge. Is that right?
Yeah, they do. They're a bit of a Frankenstein. I had to use the current DC policy plus then what we had proposed for the Te Papa local DC to give a fairer assessment. But obviously we are proposing changes to citywide DCs, which are incorporated in those numbers for the upcoming DC policy. So they're really just to give you a sense of the shape of it.
So really, I guess it just comes back to the recommendation about the key decision we're seeking is whether the council wishes to consult through the LTP on potentially having development contribution incentives through in the city centre area.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Just a couple of comments. I certainly support consulting potentially on the incentives, but on the basis that it's quite a wide consultation in the sense of actually getting ideas from the community and the development community. So probably framing it so that we can get that range of input. I think we need to be very clear what outcomes we are seeking in terms of potentially putting some incentive arrangement in place. And I did, because there's a link in our report to the situation in Hamilton City and what they've been doing. And this is just in terms of their 50% high-rise remission for buildings under 6 stories, and there's been a remission granted of 20,000, one of 7,500, one of just under 7,000. I would have thought if a development was relying on a remission at that scale, there may not be viable in the overall sense. So just wanted to, and I think that reinforces again what we're trying to achieve and what are the outcomes clearly that we are seeking if we put such a regime in place. And my other comment, really want to detail, is in terms of the area which may apply, being if it's greater than the core of the city centre or a large area, what that exactly is. So that's just something in terms of as the proposition gets developed further. Questions? I've got Stephen and Shad.
Thank you, Chair. And likewise, I support the commitment to consult on this, but note that the consultation balance could well be quite skewed in favour of developers who will obviously lap up at any opportunity to reduce their costs versus the wider community who won't necessarily understand the implications of this. So I think that, as you've rightly said, we need to be very clear about what we're seeking to achieve and why, because this actually runs counter to our intention to sheet home costs where they fairly lie. And so what we need to be clear here is what is the wider community benefit of encouraging greater density in the CBD, and can we quantify that? So I think we're going to have some very clear advice from staff on, you know, what is the wider benefit that would justify this sort of strategic direction. And like you, if the incentives are marginal, then they're not going to make much difference anyway, so why go to all the hassle? But if, on the other hand, we can hear a clear case from the development community that this would really make a difference, and we can see that there is a wider benefit that the community should be contributing to get those benefits, then maybe there's a case. But right now, I'd have to say there's major question marks over it in my head, but happy to consult so that we can be informed on the issue.
Thank you. Shad.
Yeah, I'm happy to move the recommendation to consult, and yeah, I've got similar views to Stephen in that regard. So yeah, happy for us to push it out and then have this conversation with the community and with the development community about where the opportunities lie.
Okay, so in terms of just a clarification, recommendation B agrees to consult. Inherent in that is the proposition of staff coming back to us for a further discussion in terms of the nature and scope, outcomes, etc.
Yes, so what will happen is we will consider the submissions that come and then craft an issues and options report back to yourselves for decision making as part of the LTP process, and we can pick up in substantially more detail some of those issues that have been raised today.
That's fine at the end of the process.
The consultation document.
Yes.
Yeah. So the consultation document is on the agenda for the 11th, and we have a discussion with you today and tomorrow. We can get some of this drafted. That's for audit, and you can still make changes to that, particularly as this is more around framing. So it's not changing numbers. So we've got a little bit more time. So we'd put it in as a staff worded draft to get it into the the audit process, and we can refine the framing of that over the next couple of weeks so that when you come to adopt the final for consultation, it will be something that you're more comfortable with. I think this would be, we can do that.
Yep, no, thank you. Now it's been moved. Shad, you've moved that. Stephen by seconded, page 82, to receive the report and agree to consult. Also on the basis of the discussion we've just had. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. So we'll move to item 11.5.
I can introduce this, and we've got Richard Hearn from Wakakatahi who's going to speak to this, and the team that have been working on it, so Alistair Talbot and Sarah Dove. So this is a piece of work that the Commission approved us proceeding with jointly with Wakakatahi, which is to look at a variable road pricing arrangement. So you'll recall in the last LTP, or the LTP that you adopted and the LTPA, in both of those documents, you talked about exploring a range of funding and financing opportunities given where council was sitting in terms of its fiscal position. And you also noted the need for significant transport investment to deliver on the transport system plan. And so looking at both things together, one of the pieces of work that you asked us to do was to explore jointly an opportunity of dynamic road pricing, which, as we drilled a bit further, it became more around variable road pricing. So that work has been completed. So this is the formal report to you of that technical work. It is quite technical, so the team will have tried to make it into something that's a bit more digestible in a simple way for the community. And what we're looking to do, if you're comfortable, is then to take this out for a broader community conversation through the LTP, not proposing it in the financials, but certainly starting to canvass with the community whether they agree with the concept and whether they believe it will achieve the wider benefits that we're looking for, and deliver on some of the issues around transport demand, managing congestion, changing people's behaviour, etc. So I'll just hand over the team to work through.
Thanks, Christine. Alistair.
Oh, thanks, Christine. Good morning, all. That's a helpful introduction. It probably cut short some of what I can talk about. I guess at a high level, it's probably helpful just explaining what we considered as variable road pricing in the study. And that's essentially a charge to all users to access and then travel on the main transport corridors across Tauranga. And then that charge could vary over the time of the day or the day of the week, or depending on traffic demand. The objective was very the objectives of the study were very clear. They were intended to focus on what the benefits and implications of a variable road pricing scheme could be to urban form outcomes, being those identified by the Urban Form and Transport Initiative, but also look at how it could improve the performance of the transport network generally. What we're also focused on is whether variable road pricing could introduce a viable new revenue stream. You'll see in the report that the study findings did identify a number of quite considerable benefits, certainly in terms of transport network performance. It showed at the two modelled years, that in 2035 and 2048, that it could lead to reduced congestion, it could lead to more reliable travel times, certainly could deliver more mode shifts, so that's from the private vehicle into other modes of travel, and it could have environmental benefits associated with reduced emissions and some vehicle kilometre travel reduction. From a revenue perspective, the study identified that there is a considerable funding source from a road pricing, from this road pricing scheme that was estimated to be around 88 million at a 2035 year. That's net revenue per annum, and that could increase to around 158 million, again net revenue at 2048. There's certainly some limitations with the study, and I think they need to be acknowledged. This study is at a proof of concept level only, so would require further technical analysis, certainly around costs and benefits. That work could happen through, a future stage of work if that was to progress. Also worth noting that the study analysis used the UFD network and services as its base for comparison, and there would need to be some improvement to that base network and services, so public transport services, to deliver those benefits. Again, future study could look at that in more detail in the actual sequencing and sort of scope and shape of projects to help support road pricing scheme. One other sort of key matter just worth noting, equity as a road pricing scheme has potential to impact people's equity, and certainly any next stage of work would need to look at how those equity impacts of pricing could be addressed. And then just to sum up, what the study does identify is that technologically, road pricing is viable for a city of a population density of Tauranga. That's when considered relative to where it's operating elsewhere in the world. And the recommendations of the report note those key benefits I've touched on, but also identify that there are current legislative constraints to implementing road pricing. And finally, there's the recommendations, given the benefits that have been identified, that there's an opportunity to have that initial and early consultation with the community on the concept of this scheme through the LTP development process if commissioners decided that was appropriate. Richard may also want to make a couple of comments on the project here. Wakate, the key project partner, and work very closely.
Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make 4 brief comments, if that's okay. The first one is I'd like to commend the commissioners for your leadership, your vision and your courage to look at something that's innovative, disruptive, but future focused. Second comment, so I'd just like to put on the record that working with the city staff, I found them really professional.
You just move your microphone.
I found them really professional, very competent and community minded. So that was a productive experience. My third comment is around road pricing generally. My sense is that the enduring transport challenge, particularly for cities, is actually geometry. And by that I mean the physical space allocated to moving people and vehicles. And if we play forward from today to tomorrow and we have a decarbonised transport system, we have electric vehicles, we may have autonomous vehicles, we're still faced with geometry. And in my understanding, road pricing is the most effective tool to address the challenge of geometry in the future, particularly when it's with integrated package of other initiatives. Fourth and last comment, I'm not a transport modelling expert. My judgment is that the study results probably understate significantly what the price points would be in reality and would have to be. They understate the scale of variability that would be needed because you would have higher price points at peak travel times. That would flow through to more significant impacts on downward pressure on vehicle kilometres travelled. And my sense would be that the public transport mode shift is probably understated too, and that plays through to needing a much improved service offering. That's my reflection. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So just before I turn to Stephen, who has some comments and questions, just 2 or 3 comments, and just picking up your comment, Richard, in terms of modelling and generally the conservatism of that. So, and certainly my experience in terms of over a long period of time, the modelling and then reality, and we've reached reality a lot sooner than what some of the modelling has suggested. So I just raised that. 2 other points I note in paragraph 15, the last bullet point: successful implementation of the VRP concepts dependent on the availability of efficient, convenient PT services and alternative traffic mode options. And the last point on paragraph 25, and I think it's important, significant investment in transport options, particularly those providing improved travel choices, would be needed before implementing the smart trip concept. So I just wanted to note that because in terms of some responses around those matters also. Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. And I am pleased to see that this agenda is progressing, albeit we have to engage very proactively with the community, and that is the intention of the recommendations here. I would like to make some comments, Chair, but I do have a couple of questions that I might put first. My first question is, assuming that we did get public support and legislative change, and those are 2 very significant assumptions, but let's say the way was clear and we were in a position that we could implement such a concept, what would be the alternative if we didn't? In other words, what does the future look like without pricing in the city? What will congestion be like? What will levels of service be like, given our current kind of funding paradigm? If you could comment on that, please.
Economic catastrophe and terrible well-being for communities, and I don't think that's overstating it.
In terms of the modelling, do we have any data on that?
Yes, we do. Essentially, the future without alternative tools like this to influence demand show quite considerably financial investment and improvements, but despite that, increasing congestion, increasing delay. This tool, as it's been modelled and shown, shows that we can achieve the outcomes better and sooner than with the current tool arrangements that we have available to us.
My second question is, assuming we didn't have the revenue from smart trip pricing and we relied on the current funding mechanisms, would there be adequate funding coming through to support the level of investment required to meet the demands of the transport system in the future?
I think that's the answer to that is we don't have an approved funding plan for UFTI. We've got a good sense of the costs, but there isn't an approved funding plan across all the partners. So no, there would continue to be financial constraints to deliver the outcomes that UFTI sets out to achieve.
So even with the investments included with UFTI, we are facing a future where congestion is going to be quite a bit worse. And as Richard said, economic disaster, I think was the word. But we don't have the money to fund the investments that are planned to deliver UFTI, yeah?
Yeah, and I think that's the basis. That's the basis for why this initiative is has been got underway. There's a broader piece of work looking at funding and financing arrangements generally. This is one of the arms to that piece of work. Yes, congestion increases, but mode choice does improve under RUFD. The environmental benefits do improve, but that congestion still increases. So yeah, there is a potentially better outcome if we're able to use this tool.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, to me, those answers underline the reason why we need to investigate this further. The reality is what we're asking for here is that we go to consultation on the options, or on the option of investigating this further. So it is by no means a commitment, but it does enable us to start to tell the story to the community, to increase understanding about what happens if we do proceed with such a concept versus what happens if we don't. And I think that's really important that the community do understand. I was very interested in the observations that were in the report that the benefits from introduction of smart trip variable pricing were more than most of the other alternatives that we could do, including investment in a much better transport system, for which I might say we don't have the money for anyway, and including shifter modes and all of those working from home, and all of those other potential things. Smart Trip adds to the impetus of all of those initiatives, and therefore has a very high benefit cost ratio and good outcomes for the community. The key to it, I think, is understanding the benefits, because I think the danger in any of these conversations is that we always focus in on the toll or the price or the charge, and we don't consider what it's delivering. And at the moment, we have what I describe as dumb tolls in Tauranga. They're dumb because they don't change. And when congestion is high, you pay the same relative cost to that when there is no congestion, or indeed it's the middle of the night and there's scarcely a car, you still pay the same toll. What Smart Trip is about is changing that according to the level of demand. And the key benefit from a road user point of view, who are going to be paying the toll, is that they would get a faster trip. And so you start to get value for money instead of just paying a dumb toll. So if road users can get a faster trip, it's worth paying the price. And by the way, it also enables an investment program with the additional revenue that comes from the road pricing to invest in a better transport system than we otherwise would have. So there's kind of a double whammy from the point of view of those paying the toll. They'll get a faster trip, and you'll get a better transport system because there'll be money to invest in a better transport system. And I think it's really important to understand that. And the counterfactual is that if they don't pay and we don't introduce Smart Trip, then things are going to get worse into the future. So there really is quite considerable benefits in this. And then if we look at it beyond users to the wider public policy perspective, it reinforces all of the things that we're trying to achieve. Encouraging and promoting a shift to public transport, reducing unnecessary vehicle kilometres travelled, and those are two very significant imperatives for the city. If we don't proceed with this kind of concept, then VKT will continue to increase, carbon emissions will continue to increase, and public transport mode share will continue to be flat. If we combine this with smart use of how we use our land development in the city and enable people to better connect from where they live to where they work through viable public transport on the Western Corridor is key to that, along with intensification along Te Papa, then we can connect where people live to 70% of the jobs in the city along that corridor. And it is also the reason why we're investing so significantly in Cameron Road. So I think if you put all of these elements together, there is a very compelling case where we get better transport land use integration, and we have a smarter means of both raising funds for investment in our transport system and charging users so that they benefit from faster trips. And it all comes together as a combined and compelling story as to what we need to do for the future. But we aren't at that point yet. The point we're at is to go out to the community and say, this is on offer. This is something we believe we should investigate further, and good things happening with central government and political party support for change of legislation, and that certainly looks encouraging. At this stage, we have multi-party, in fact, cross-parliament support for amending the land transport management to enable pricing. So we could well be in a position in Tauranga where we can lead thinking, just like the city has been in the past, where it has accepted tolls to accelerate investment in the transport system. And frankly, had we not done that back in the 90s, when the first Harbour Bridge toll was put in place, goodness knows what the state of our transport system would be now, because that toll enabled the whole PJK to proceed, and we're still and we're living today off the benefits of that commitment done in that time. So the city has innovated in the past, and here's going to be an opportunity potentially for it to innovate into the future. Chair, I'm very happy to support the recommendations and move them.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Shad.
Not a lot to say past what Stephen's just outlined. It's interesting, just thinking back 20 odd years ago when I was at Ministry of Transport with Richard and having some of these conversations about congestion pricing and the way we fund and fund transport through excise, and thinking about pricing 20 odd years ago. And we haven't made a lot of progress since then. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for the city to, as Stephen's outlined, to show leadership in that space when it comes to getting ahead of the game. You know, we've heard from a couple of the political parties, well, one in particular that's thinking about transport pricing, road pricing, as a way to fund a future transport system. So there is an opportunity for us, I think, as a city to show leadership. And I suppose from a consultation perspective, when we're out there through the long-term plan promoting smart trip and the concept of variable road pricing, is that story that's kind of wrapped around it. That, and as Stephen's outlined, outlining what the benefits are to the community. So from an engagement and a consultation perspective, we do need a strong story around why we think this is a good idea, and to be able to test it fairly with the community. I mean, we've had tolls here since 1988, I think it is. I mean, I've grown up with tolls. I'm used to tolls, although I lived away for a little while, come back, but we've still got tolls. So, but I think one of the other parts of that conversation is, and Stephen's noted it in previous conversations, is we do need that support from central government. So not just us paying, but actually what contribution can central government make to support what we do here. Otherwise, we just, you know, our community just continues to pay. But if we do it in a smart way and focus on levels of service and the delivery of what our city needs, there's a whole lot of benefits that flow through. So I'm happy to second the recommendation that we go out and consult, but we do need a strong consultation and engagement process around how we talk to the community about this, because it can be quite complicated. So we need a simple way to articulate what the benefits are.
Thanks, Shad, and certainly support the comments around that story, because we have a document in front of us in terms of the technical report, which is fine for those who can want to immerse themselves in that, but how we frame this clearly outline the benefits, and picking up Stephen's point that it's just not a focus on what the cost is, but in terms of the wider benefit. And the objectives are clearly outlined, I think, in paragraph 8 of our report. 2 or 3 questions in terms of paragraph 25 talks about that significant investment in transport solutions. Just wanted, Alistair, a quick outline of what say, for example, a handful of those solutions are, because that's talking about those projects being implemented prior to actually getting to, if, for example, the process ends up with a smart trip, what needs to occur before all that happens, because it's not a quick fix in terms of the funding and the outcomes sought.
Oh, sorry. So I think that the next stage of work really needs to delve into quite a bit of detail around the mix and shape of the projects that would then provide that base network to provide a viable road pricing scheme. But the work that's been undertaken to date, and that's also been tested with what's been underpinning successful road pricing schemes elsewhere, really focused around the projects that provide and the services that provide that transport choice, so people have a viable alternative. I guess the type of projects that are really focused on that across the city at the moment are those projects that are looking at 15th Ave, Cameron Road, Hewlett's Road, the Tauranga project. So there are a number of projects there that are really focused on, well, they have multiple objectives and outcomes, but certainly they add up to then providing that viable choice for people. So, yeah, a little bit of a roundabout answer, but I think it's that next stage of work where we could actually sort of plug in different projects, and it might even be at a corridor level that you find road pricing could work initially and then be rolled out across the city rather than a sort of a one hit and then that is it. So, yeah, more work to do. It's proof of concept only at this stage.
So just following on from that, in terms of the work done to date, proof of concept and the recommendations we have before us, in terms of those further investigations and burrowing into some of the matters that you have just responded on, is that something that happens post the engagement through the LTP, or is there some further work required prior to that engagement process?
My sense is that we may be able to work on things like developing scopes for future stages of work, but I think we would need to wait for that feedback from the community to then help confirm that scope and I guess the level of support or otherwise towards a concept. Others may have a view too.
I guess there's also some strategic choices for you around, how do you grow the pie before you cut the pie? Because this is not a topic that will sit in isolation, either in delivery terms or in revenue terms. And how do you define the beneficiaries that might pay? How do you integrate land transport with your land use aspirations? So I think there's quite a rich conversation. There's the community conversation, so I think that's also code language for saying that a business case would take some time to complete, because this hasn't never happened before. There's national policy issues that will get dragged into this conversation. You'll have sub-regional conversations around development, beneficiaries, how to maximise the revenue stream. You're talking potentially several $1 billion worth of revenue if this is managed in a way that commercials are right.
Thanks, Richard. Christine.
You're just picking up on that. So at the moment, there's no funding in the LTP for the next stage. And I think the point that Richard's making, it's not, Tauranga has taken a leadership role in this. It would be a national issue because it needs legislative change. It would depend on who the incoming government is and their appetite and interest in legislative change, but it also would affect other cities. And so I think there's an opportunity to work with others. So, but if we can take the feedback from our community, it will probably be indicative of what other communities would say, although ours, because we've got tolling, one of the few places in New Zealand that does have tolling, that might be helpful, and then can share that with others and look potentially to do something a bit more joined up, because unless it's joined up, it's unlikely to be able to be implemented given the national policy issues. So that would be the next stage.
Okay, no, thank you. Any other questions or comments? It's been moved by Stephen, seconded by Shad. I support the comments already made, and certainly support the initiative and then going to the next stage of engagement. So if there's nothing further, there are the recommendations on page 85 from A to E. Okay, I'll put that. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you. So we'll now move to 11 yes, it is, report 11.6, the Tauranga. Okay, Tauranga City growth projections and allocations.
While the team's coming up, I'll just introduce this. So we talked to you recently about that in terms of plan change to D3, we're doing some work to understand what would be enabled in terms of the zoning, but then also looking at feasibility and what other factors might impact how much actual development is on the ground. And I think Commissioner Selwood asked a specific question at the last Smart Growth meeting. We indicated that the work was underway. So that work's being completed. So the team will report back on that, and our intention is that that would be reported also to the next Smart Growth meeting, consider as it has wider implications. And the other piece of work, as you've been working through the long-term plan, you've made some, you've provided direction around the investment and growth infrastructure, and you've made the call that you're going to focus predominantly on the Tauranga West area as a priority, intensification particularly to Papa, and then supporting existing zoned areas. And then you've also said that in terms of other areas, including areas like Keenan and Te Tumu, your focus is on ensuring you've got the land in place, the planning is done, land use planning and the infrastructure planning is done, but not investing in the capital. So once you've made those direction calls, we undertook to go back and look at what implications that would have for when those houses would come on stream and how that might affect growth capacity. So that's the second part of this equation today, around those growth projections and allocations that the team's going to report back.
Thank you. Andy.
Okay, I'll kick off and cover the probably intensification side of things, and then I'll let Ave cover the impacts around Te Tumu and Keenan Road being outside of the LTP. So the current projection of intensification over the next 30 years, which is adopted through the Housing and Business Assessment, and as part of our LTP growth projections, including our 30-year infrastructure strategy, is approximately 19,000 dwellings out of a total of approximately 30,000 dwellings being delivered through sort of intensification and completion of those existing urban growth areas that are underway at the moment. So the likes of Wairaki and undeveloped sites in Papamoa, Bethlehem, etc. There's been a few question marks around that level of intensification, particularly given challenges of vertical construction at the moment, the high costs of apartment building construction, and some of the challenges of ground conditions in the city, meaning foundations need to go vastly down into the ground, be a very expensive and prohibitive component of quite a number of projects at this point in time. So I'll come to that. So what we've done through Plan Change 33 is a full development capacity assessment. That starts with looking at the first step being what is plan enabled through Plan Change 33. And that is effectively a theoretical exercise of saying, what if every single site in the city was built out to its full extent under the planning provision? So that means effectively 3-storey terraced houses across the medium density residential zone, which is now would be the predominant zone across the city in all suburbs, and then around in our high density areas like Te Papa and around some of the other centres in the city, apartments ranging in height from 4 through 6 and 8 stories. That theoretical exercise gets you to about 350,000 new dwellings, which could support roughly about 900,000 people. Now, we know that that's is not required. Our growth projections for the city are only about 30,000 dwellings over the next 30 years, and around 40,000 dwellings once you incorporate Western Bay into the equation as well. So this is just part of the process that we need to go through under the NPS for urban development. And then you start to overlay the other components of the development capacity assessment. So the first one is infrastructure. What are we building out? What does our infrastructure kind of growth would it cope with at the moment? And then layering on top of the planned infrastructure that we are going to put in place. And that infrastructure assessment has all been sort of based around that sort of 30,000 dwelling mark. So, you know, you're automatically starting to reduce and starting to talk about that amount of homes. There are quite a number of other constraints. So there's quite a lot of covenants around our city that constrain redevelopment of a number of sites, particularly in greenfield areas. And then there is the feasibility of development. So feasibility is looking at it from a commercial perspective and saying, would it be profitable to build terraced houses or townhouses or apartments or what have you on a particular site? So feasibility is a significant constraint. We had Veros assess feasibility from us, and their assessment over the 30-year period is that about 140,000 dwellings of the 350,000 dwellings that would be plan enabled would be feasible. Most of that feasibility sits in the kind of townhouse, kind of two-story terraced housing kind of space, not in the vertical apartment building space. Where vertical apartment buildings start to become part of the mix is further out, so beyond 10 years. There will, of course, be always some, but in terms of becoming more easier for developers to deliver, that's assumed to occur later in the 30-year period. And then you start to overlay the final component, which is realisation. Only a proportion of what is feasible will be realised for a variety of reasons. So, for example, 10 apartment buildings might be feasible, but the market might only be large enough to accommodate sales for one of them at a particular price point. So realisation reduces that number significantly, and it equates to roughly around the level of intensification that we have assumed. And so we've got a reasonable level of comfort that that sort of 19,000 mark is around about right. To get up to the 30,000 dwellings that we need to provide, that's where our future greenfield areas come to play. So particularly Tauranga West in the near term, then moving into areas like Keenan Road and Te Tumu in the longer term. So that is where we are at in terms of, I guess, that review of those intensification provisions. Pretty comfortable with those numbers moving forward. They do ramp up over time. So the intensification projections for the first 10 years are much lower than what they are in years 10 to 30. Ava's done some work looking at the effects of not including the capex for Keenan Road and Te Tumu in the LTP, what that means for our growth projections.
So in the report from sort of clause 33, it sets out the assessment that was undertaken. So at the moment we have the growth projections for the city. It's allocated down to a mesh block level based on number of considerations around, and he's just covered the intensification work. We also, for each of the operative greenfield areas, we monitor that on a quarterly basis and make sure that where we've allocated growth, it's actually happening, and we move that around each year. It doesn't quite line up. And for the future greenfield areas, figure 4 sort of sets out what we've allocated as far as dwelling growth. Over the LTP period from 24 to 34, for the 4 new greenfield growth areas anticipated to come on stream over that period. And then the next part's outside the LTP period from 34 to 40. So the changes proposed to Te Tumu and Keenan Road, currently in the allocation, are assumed to be released the latter period of the 28 to 33 period, so early 2030s. Pushing those and the growth allocated to those areas is in figure 4. So there's about 1,000 dwellings currently allocated to those two areas. And in the period from 34 to 40, there's about 1,700 dwellings currently assumed and allocated. Those two areas are pushed out to 2040 release. The impact's 2,600 dwellings. We did an assessment across the city, just looking at our current assumptions and allocations to other parts of the city, to see whether it was realistic to increase allocation in other areas to pick up the reduction. Through that work, there were a few areas, Pies Par West, more around the Kennedy Road area, that's proposed to be rezoned under Plan Change 33 from large lot to high density. We did a bit of work around there and think it's realistic for another 200 dwellings to go in through that area. Through Bethlehem, there's the farm site. So we think that goes ahead. There's 300 dwellings could go into that area, and there's two other sites in Bethlehem. One behind the Birthing Centre, we've had a number of proposals through, and that keeps increasing. So we've upped that, and there's another site there. So together, including other sort of infill intensification, particularly along the coastal strip, we think we could offset that partially, but that there would still be a net difference through the LTP of around 640 dwellings, and over that longer term period from 34 to 40, another 1,260. So in all, 1,900 dwellings.
So thanks, Dave. I guess the summary of it is that for the LTP, we're suggesting a reduction of around 600 dwellings over the longer term period that will be greater. That will add to our dwelling shortfall that we have across the city and the non-compliance issues we have with the National Policy for Urban Development around development capacity requirements. Whilst this is not necessarily a positive story around those issues, there are opportunities potentially to bring in other funding to open up and new innovative funding measures to open up those growth areas faster. Obviously, the removal of them from the LTP is driven by broader fiscal constraints, the amount of debt, the level of rates that is reasonable to sustain moving forward for the city. So there are still opportunities that we need to investigate. And while that's sort of going backwards a little bit, paragraph 40 of the report does set out some of the I guess the positive movement that there has been recently on a number of housing projects and opportunities in the city. To offset some of that, those numbers, of course, are all included in AVE's projections already.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Anything else, Kristen? Okay, questions or comments? Stephen.
Yeah, well, it always is concerning when you have to dial back the projections, but it is important that we are realistic. But what I think it underlines is the criticality of that alternative funding and financing kind of approach. And I note the political dialogue that's going on at the moment, and an increasing understanding by central government that it has a key role to play in both enabling alternative funding and financing methods, but also prioritising investment that supports housing. And it's ironic at the moment that our current business case processes do not include housing as one of the key provision of housing as one of the key outcomes that one would invest in transport infrastructure. It's beyond me how that could possibly be the case, but it is the case. So the quicker that we can make smart transport decisions, the quicker we can bring on land supply. But the challenge for us will be how we fund the infrastructure that enables that land supply, and alternative funding and financing methods are going to be key to that. And it's germane to our last discussion, because the last discussion will enable transport investment to occur. And then the wider infrastructure provision and water in particular will largely be through prices charged by the new water entities. So there will be new ways to fund the level of investment going forward, which is why I think it's justified that we have made the decision to take the rates funding out of the LTP, because it will bring forward that conversation as to how else and how best we could fund and enable growth to pay for growth. So I think the report is timely and valuable, and it's a realistic characterisation of what our expectations will be. Thanks, Chair.
Shad, just a question around with the reduction. What is the potential impact in terms of the development contribution framework?
I guess in an overall sense, with a reduced level of development, there will be reduced level of development contribution revenue. These numbers have been passed on to finance. I'm not sure at this stage if those impacts have been calculated, but I think that's been worked on at this present point in time.
I'd like to confirm as well, obviously it also impacts on our IFF levies and our rate numbers as well. So that needs to flow through.
So then in 3 years' time, there will be a 27 to 37 long-term plan. So I'll presume there will be a review of the growth projections. Conceivably, they could then be adjusted depending on whatever happens in that 3-year period, and then that what we're looking at now could potentially change and potentially go back up.
That's correct. So there's a couple of things happening. One, through the Smart Growth Partnership, we're having a conversation about should the Smart Growth work program going forward look at a revision of our demographic projections, because they haven't been done for some time. The last census is the one before we've just done, as you recall, wasn't great, so we decided just to hold. But with the census information coming through, that's something that needs to be looked at. We do review the growth projections and the growth allocations every LTP, and it will be depends on the council of the day, the level of investment that they make in growth infrastructure as to whether or not land is able to be released. So it's a whole mix of things, and we do look at it every time around and bring that back for council direction.
So just a final question on that, Christine, then. If there's a reduction, presumably there could well be some potential reduction in infrastructure capacity, whatever that is.
Yes, so it's actually happened the other way this time. If you think about, you've made the decision, given that your call around having to balance investment for existing communities and new communities, that some of the investment that was previously indicated and cost increases that we wouldn't proceed with. And so therefore that land won't be serviced, so therefore can't come to market. So we've moved the growth projections from those areas. And it goes the other way too. If there's not sufficient growth that requires that capacity, then you don't want to invest, because you'll have infrastructure sitting there in the ground but not being utilised. And so we're trying to get, it's a constant balancing act of a whole series of factors that each LTP you really look at what's happening in the market. And we've always said that growth is sequenced, and you'll make the call for effectively to plan it and be ready to go, but just in time delivery, so that you don't have too much infrastructure sitting in the ground. Or also you want to be the other side too, that you don't have growth that's got nowhere to go, which is sort of where we've currently got. We've got a significant shortfall. It's just about massaging all of the elements within fiscal constraints that the council of the day is comfortable with.
Okay, no, thank you. Okay, moved by Shad, second by Stephen. There's no further comments or questions. So there's the two recommendations: to receive the report and to adopt the adjusted growth projections as outlined. And that's on page 113. So I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Okay. I think we'll take a short break, 10-minute break. So we'll do that, and we'll reconvene at 11:30. in terms of the item 11.7 active reserves master plans. So we'll stand adjourned for 10 minutes till then. We will reconvene. So we're report 11.7 active reserves master plans.
Thank you, Chair. You'll see that we've circulated just a big copy of the master plans. The originals were in your agenda, but just in case it's useful. I'll just start and then I'll hand over to Alison and Ross. Just want to make a comment that the adoptions of these reserves master plan and the support that you give us to continue with the project will be another milestone in the project to ensure we optimise the use of our very limited space available for sport. I think if you recall, following feedback the Commission received from sporting groups in 2021, staff had following that, they had made some high-level conversations with groups, particularly at Bay Park, at the end of that year, but more generally the conversations around this project commenced in June, July 2022, and then following that you adopted preliminary plans in October 2022. In the period between October 2022 and now, the team have engaged with each of the reserve stakeholders. They've reworked those plans, as you have in front of you, to better reflect what's required by the codes. In particular, the reason I really wanted to do the introduction is I want to acknowledge just how much time and work has gone into engagement to get us to the stage that we're at, both by the staff, particularly the two you have in front of us, but also Steve Bramley, but also from the committee, the community, the sporting codes that have willingly sat down with us and worked through what will be best for them. But we do need to note that also there will be a lot more meetings over the next 10 years before we finalise that work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that workload, particularly from a community, a volunteer community in most parts. So I've got Ross and Alison. I think this is Alison's first time in front of TCC's committee, but you do know Alison. So I'll hand over to the two of them to expand on the report and be available to answer any questions.
Hey, welcome to you both. Are you starting, Alison?
I am, thank you, Morena Tato. So as Barbara has acknowledged, there's been a lot of work undertaken over the past several months with the stakeholders from each of the reserves. We've worked really closely with them just to understand their needs for their sport requirements for now and into the future. The plans aim to minimise disruption where possible and to provide cost-effective outcomes across the reserves. As a result, there have been changes made to the plans to achieve the outcomes that we desire. The master plan for Bay Park in particular has gone through some significant revision. Notably, the Speedway pit lane is remaining where it is currently, and netball and athletics are now both located on the western side of the park. That's mainly in response to the cost, consenting issues and disruption of moving the Speedway pit lane, and also the concern that had been raised from netball and athletics around the proximity to the water treatment plant in the original plan. Reconsideration of the overall site's logistics to enable efficient and safe movement of people and vehicles was also another main reason for the changes. While we're confident in the proposed layout, there are still geotech, infrastructural and consenting issues to be resolved as we go through implementation and delivery, so further adjustments may be required. With regard to the Tauranga domains, in response to a slower staged approach for the proposed community stadium, there is now a stadium deferred master plan that seeks to enable the transition to a premier event space, as well as providing for community sport and recreation in the long term. This includes the athletics track being relocated to Bay Park at a later date than was originally envisaged at the time of the prelim master plan. With the track needing renewal at the end of the decade, we will need to make a decision regarding the future location of athletics no later than 2028. All of the master plans are at a high level to enable future development, and we are confident that they allow spatially for what is necessary for each of the sports requirements into the future. Work with the stakeholders will continue throughout the detailed design and implementation of the plans. Just to note that some of the stakeholders have requested more detail was built into the master plans as they stand now, but we were unable to do that at the stage of the process. But in response to that, we've shown our intent to work closely with the stakeholders on the plans themselves to give confidence to those groups moving forward. There are ongoing operational discussions to continue and agreements to reach, particularly around the shared use of Bay Park and how to best ensure the optimum outcome for the park as a whole. We will work closely with Bay Venues and the key stakeholders throughout that process. And just really pleased to be here today with a milestone of getting these master plans to this stage, and thank you from me too to all the staff that have been involved in the process.
Thanks, Alison. Ross, have you got anything to add?
No, nothing to add, but we're happy to take questions.
Okay, no, thank you. So I'll open it up for questions, comments. Stephen, you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Ross. I think this would be like trying to manage a family and bedrooms and kind of house allocations and all of that sort of thing. Trying to come up with a solution, not just in one park, but across the three main parks that we have in the city to reconcile the needs of all users. In a context where, frankly, we need more space, not less, is an enormous task. And so it's a credit to the team for having progressed to the level we have. So well done. I guess I should ask the question, what's your sense of the level of satisfaction of each of the codes, notwithstanding that many of them will have had to have made compromises and things wouldn't be ideal from their perspective. But what is your sense of where they're at and the level of outstanding issues still to be resolved?
I guess from my point of view, and just in the few months that I've been working with them, there's definitely been a move towards being more positive with where we are, and generally the clubs are welcoming of the changes. There are a couple that do have reservations. They've been in their places for a long time and they're passionate about where they are, but generally can see the big picture and what can be achieved by relocating and having new facilities.
The model that has been put together recognises those long-standing relationships with where they are and the history and culture that has existed for each of the codes. And we've heard in numerous council meetings the passion of particularly those affected on the domain, but also Bay Park. And the recommendations as they stand actually go a long way to ameliorating many of, if certainly don't ameliorate them all, but many of the concerns. The delayed or the proposed deferred stadium in particular provides some time and space for change for those clubs. And I do note that the athletics track is going to need renewal by the end of this decade, and the responsibility of that is on the trust to fund that. So the time lag provides both the mechanism, both the time and potentially the mechanism by which that could be achieved. So I think there's a reasonable compromise there that enables each of one of those clubs to see a way forward and to adapt to the change. Change is always going to be challenging, as we know, but it is a credit to each of the codes that they have acted positively to try and manage that and get the best outcome for their particular sport. I don't have any questions. I think the report is very clear, and I'll hand over to my colleague if you have, but I'm happy to move the recommendations, Chair.
Thanks, Stephen. Shad.
I don't necessarily have any questions either. But just from my perspective, I mean, it seems like we've landed in quite a positive space. Looking at Blake Park, I mean, there's not a lot that's changed there. Apart, we did have those conversations with netball about relocating, and it might have been about 12 months ago. My daughter was playing netball, and I was talking to some of the administrators over in the club rooms, and they were eager just to get on and look at relocating. So it's helpful that we've been able to accommodate their needs, particularly over at Bay Park. And then we also had the tennis club come in and have a chat to us about making sure that they were accommodated as well. And we haven't been hearing too much from them, so we assume that things are relatively stable. So from a Blake Park perspective, it seems to be quite a good landing space. I did see in the report, and I don't want to kind of dig through it, but I thought there was a comment in there about the existing Mount Hall that was to remain, because in here it's showing that it's been removed. Is that still being retained, or is it being removed?
Removed. It's reaching the end of its life. We're really just keeping it ticking along whilst we go through those wider changes to the indoor courts network. After which it needs to be removed.
Okay. And then also the integration across into the skate park and the improvements along Monganui Road. I think having those integrated through, I think are really positive. Probably the just thinking about getting people to and from these locations, providing for public transport in those active modes, I think is really important. We've got some additional car parking in there, and I think for community sport, removing netball from there, because it can get quite congested on Saturday mornings, I think is great, and relocating them to Bay Park. I do note we did receive an email from the Speedway raising, I wouldn't necessarily say issues, but just making sure we've factored in enough parking through the process, and I'm sure we'll work with them through those issues. And I do like the concept of those shared facilities between netball and potentially the track. We did see that when we were down in Nelson at the got the name of the park down there, where they've got shared facilities, and so it makes sense to, where we can, is to encourage clubs to share, and I think we've been able to manage that through the process. And then the domain, yep, we do need to step through that. We can't afford to step into developing a $200 million stadium at this point, and we do need to engage with the community through that proposition. So I think and then being able to accommodate the current users now, but potentially into the future. So yeah, I haven't got any comment, any questions, but just thankful to the team and to Steve in managing those relationships and managing our engagement through that process. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and just following on from all those comments, really pleased with that integrated approach in terms of how all these particular sites and venues fit together. Just going back in history, prior to 1989, when we had 3 or 4 units of local government, they all had their own netball courts and a whole range of facilities. So it was all small facilities, both in the Mount and the old county and the former city. So really pleased in terms of the approach taken. At the end of the day, it's what's best for the overall city and what's appropriate in each of those venues. Alison, you mentioned that, and it's noted in the resolution, but you talked about that continued engagement, and I see that's absolutely critical, and Shad's picked up in terms of an email we got this morning on various matters. I take that to mean, in terms of your commentary, that engagement carries on across all of the sites with all of the range of those codes and groups. And that part of that is working through the actual detailed design, where you noted that some wanted more detail on the master plans than what's there.
Absolutely, that will be an integral part of making these as successful as they can be. The spatial allocations are based on the conversations that we've had with the groups and also the necessary guidelines for the sporting codes. But as far as understanding those key detailed aspects that they need to be able to make their sport and club work, and just their knowledge that they have, it'll be really important for us to work closely with all of them moving forward across all of the reserves.
No, thank you. And I just would also like to acknowledge the input of the codes and the clubs, and you know, it has been for some, you know, a change process and quite difficult over the last 12 or 16 months. So just acknowledging that, because that's important also going forward. So I've got nothing else. I'm happy to move the. Have you moved that? Do we have a? Good. And second by Shad. Oh, well, that's fine. There's nothing further. And so we're on page on 120 and receiving the report adopting the Lake Park Master Plan and request staff to proceed with its implementation, adopting the revised Bay Park Master Plan, and also again continuing with implementation and working with Bay venues and current and future site users, and adopts the Tauranga Domain Precinct Stadium Deferred Master Plan. And as noted earlier, I think that's important in terms of starting a journey that will last a period of time. And then obviously delegating to the CE or appointee to make further decisions on minor amendments. Those are the recommendations, been moved and seconded. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So, next is 11.8, which is the annual report on dog control policy and practice. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. We're required to report annually on the administration of our dog control services, and the Act has really specific requirements that must be reported on. So this report fulfills that requirement. It's quite short. You'll see that we've discussed that there's been a number of complaints and dogs impounded and acts of aggression that are increasing, but we've got more dogs in the city, so that's just to be expected, and it's not something that the team are concerned about. There's just a couple of highlights in there to note. We've had a great uptake in our microchipping service, so it's more than doubled, which is excellent. It's just $30 for people down at the pound. More than 80% of our dogs that are impounded released back to owners or adopted. Our new Facebook page that's been running for about a year has been really successful in getting those dogs adopted. And finally, we're just getting some really great feedback on the education services that the team provide, awareness raising. They do a lot of schoolwork. Particularly when students are concerned, they hear things in the media and they send the team questions. So we make a deliberate effort to get out to schools and talk to the students about the work that we do and the council does. And I'll just note that the Bark in the Park is coming up on the 30th September, and that's a really important part of that process.
Okay, no, thanks, Sarah. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the work of the Animal Services team. We had a visit to the pound a few weeks ago, and I think the work they undertake, sometimes in quite difficult, emotional, and dangerous circumstances. So just wanted to acknowledge that on behalf of the Commission. And also picking up, given there had been an increase of well over 2,000 dogs, the trends compared to 2019, they've moved a wee bit, but by and large, there hasn't been a dramatic change, notwithstanding that increase. Questions? Chad.
Thanks, Sarah. I support Bill's comments about the work that our people do out there in the community, and really about encouraging responsibility for dog owners, but also protecting where we do have out of control dogs. When we were at one of our city talk events, Barbara and I were having a conversation with a couple of people, and they raised, it's not necessarily related to the dog behaviour matter. We did encourage them to potentially come to the long-term plan to make a submission, and that was around a dog park. So they indicated that they go all the way up to Tech Park to run the dog. I have seen dogs in parks running loose. So yeah, anyway, it was just a suggestion, and we've encouraged them to make a submission. So hopefully we might see some of that come through. I don't know where, but it might be worth the team having a think about a potential dog park at some point. And I'm happy to move that.
Okay, report. I'm happy to second. So that's to receive the report and page here, and adopt the report on dog management policy and practice. It's been moved and seconded. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So now we'll move to report 11.9, the Park and Ride Trial Project and budgeted expenditure.
Kia ora, Commission.
Nick.
So we have a string of transport papers now, 4 I think, to finish the open part of the meeting. So with the pressures of the transport system and the pressure that is under, Commission has asked us to look at options for park and ride and identify sites and their respective benefits to the travelling community. It is something that we have looked at for a long time. We have wads of paper of investigations into park and ride, and have struggled for a long time to get an approved business case across the line. So the intent of this is for regardless of I guess the business case per se, we're wanting to trial it. So that's the intent of this one. And so we have carried out a feasibility study and now have a preferred option, which is a trial site for a 2-year trial to assess predominantly the attractiveness of it and see what sort of uptake we can get. So yeah, I'll hand over to the team to fill you in a bit more about the detail.
Okay, thank you.
Morena koutou, so Ruth Cable Manager, Transportation Outcomes. I've got Nigel Holman here on my right, who is the Project Manager for the Park and Ride. So I'll just do a few introductory remarks and then Nigel will be able to answer any questions for you on the project. So the proposed Park and Ride is situated at Tauranga Road, Papamoa. And the 2-year trial, as Nick said, it will just enable us to measure the uptake and the outcomes of the facility. There is an option to make that permanent at the completion of the trial. So as noted in the paper, the operational benefits of a park and ride are supported through more than just the built facility. They rely on quality public transport. They require high frequency and an express bus service, as well as a bus priority lane that enables that separation from traffic. And it's those bus services that really encourage the use of the facility. So the operation of the express bus service relies on funding from the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. That funding is being sought from the Regional Council at the end of September. So given the dependency on the Regional Council funding for the express bus service, we're seeking your approval today for the capital and operational funding just to progress with the park and ride at Tauranga Road contingent on that express bus service being funded at the end of September. So if we do get that funding at the end of September and we push go, we'll be able to deliver that park and ride. The current forecast date is March 2024. Questions?
Okay. Shad.
Great initiative, and it was interesting thinking back to when we first started. We had a couple of conversations with the regional council, and they kept pushing, we need park and ride, we need park and ride. Well, we've got a solution, so hopefully they can come to the party in terms of that express bus service. So I think to be able to provide alternatives and, you know, hopefully delivering a service that can get people into the city quicker than in your car from Papamoa at the moment, I think would be a great outcome. The 200 odd car parks is, you know, it'd be great to monitor that and see how we fill that space, hopefully. And then also, yeah, just providing that alternative arrangement. One of the other things I think we're kind of looking at is we do need, so at the moment that site is owned by Waka Kotahi, from what I understand, and it's another in conversations with Ngā Pōtiki as a potentially a surplus piece of land dropping out of the TEL. So long term, you know, if this is successful, what would that mean and what would that look like?
So as stated, that the 2 years lines up with how long the Crown have until they have made the decision on disposal, and that's subject to the findings of a current PT services business case that's jointly getting delivered with Wakatai, TCC and Bay Plenty. This area had been identified as a potential park and ride as part of TSB, and that's what I guess the business case, and that would give the emphasis to keep the land for that use. Otherwise, it would then go back through the standard Lens Crown disposal process, which has a quite a fixed way of how that gets managed. Obviously, emphasising with opportunities to give back to the previous landowner or back for if there's a need for still public works. So yeah.
Brendan.
What I was going to say is the park and ride facility does fit with what the land was purchased for. It's purchased for transport uses, so the park and ride facility does meet that need. So if it was to stay there long term, it can do under the Public Works Act because it was purchased for transport needs.
Just on the subject site, Brendan, so so it's proposed it can accommodate 200 car parks. Is that just for the trial site? Is there land that's part of the site that's not needed? Or is that all of the site in terms of...
Yeah, sure. The 200 is for the trial itself, which, as mentioned, will get monitored. The rest of the land has got room to cater for more. So obviously it's filled at the moment, but yeah, the actual gravel car park facility would be 200, but there is opportunity for more as needed.
One potential option is that there is quite a large site there. It's far bigger than we potentially need for a park and ride, so it would be possible for council to purchase the whole site, put in some sports fields, and then we could use the car parking from the park and ride facility in the weekends for sports grounds car parking. So there is a bit of a dual use option if it was proven to be successful.
Okay, no, thank you. Stephen.
I'm very supportive of this initiative like Shad. To me, I think it's a no-brainer. I do hope citizens respond to the opportunity, because I don't know how many times I've been on the council hearing about the need for car parking in the city. It is a continual and chronic request. And if I compare sort of 200 car parks in Tara Road linked by a good express bus service into the city to building a 200 car park capacity in the city or indeed at the Mount, the cost would be astronomically more. The cost of OPEX would be considerably more. And we would still have the problem with trying to accommodate those 200 vehicles and an ever increasing congestion problem on the roads that connect the two areas. So what we've got here is an opportunity to accommodate 200 people out of their cars onto a bus that will run down the bus lane pretty much as fast as the car, if not faster, and get into the city and not have to worry about paying for a park when you get to the city or the mount. It's an absolute no-brainer. It just relies on two things. One, that regional council can come up with an effective and efficient express bus service that really provides value to people. And I note that they've got a meeting at the end of the month to consider that, and I'd be very disappointed if they weren't able to approve it, especially given the representations that have often been made by regional council members to us that we need park and ride. So hopefully that hurdle is going to be easily overcome. And then the other issue really is the level of uptake by the community. And I hope they see the opportunity here, because it is a great opportunity. If you really want to make a difference about reducing your carbon footprint, here's a way you can do it. If you want to have convenience and speed to get into the city, here's a way to do it. And if you want not to be stuck in traffic and grinding your way through the gears or up and down the auto as the stop-start traffic, here's a way to do it. So I think it's an absolute no-brainer. I'm hopeful that this is the start of several park and rides across the city, and here's the opportunity to really demonstrate the difference they can make. So I'm very happy to move the recommendations, Chair.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm happy to second. I do have one or two questions. In terms of the single stage business case, which is under development, the Waka Kotahi funding would only be available from 1 July next year. At this point in time, because the business case is still under development, that's also uncertain as a funding source. Is that correct?
That is correct. At the moment, we're proposing to fund it from underspend within the overall transport budget in this financial year. So there is sufficient funds that we could pay for the capital works required in this financial year.
Yeah. It's been moved and seconded.
I was just going to say, Chair, I'd much rather be spending the money on doing something than funding another business case, which could take years to actually come to fruition.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. And that's where are we? It's on page 136 to receive the report, approve the establishment of the park and ride as a trial for 2 years, approves the capital budget being transferred from other projects, and approves the operational budget for the 2-year period. And on the way past, just reiterating Stephen's comments, and hopefully that will be a successful meeting on the 21st of September at the Regional Council in terms of that express bus service.
Thinking might be worth us making representation to that meeting.
Yes, the members of the Joint Public Transport Committee are attending that meeting to present.
Do intend to make a submission in support.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Now we go to 1110 Transport Choices Granada on Granada Street. Just as a note, and this is for my fellow commissioners, we have another meeting commitment at 1 p.m. back at 3rd Avenue. So I'm just saying that. Okay, so we're on page 144.
Good morning.
Morning, Karen.
If I may introduce Chris Barton. He's done an amazing job in terms of leading this particular project in a very short space of time. So I'll leave Chris to introduce the report, but also to welcome Erica Walker from Waka Kotahi, representing the National Transport Choices Program. Thank you.
Okay, welcome, Chris.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. So this report relates to plan changes along Granada Street in Arataki to particularly provide improvements to cycling public transport infrastructure between Girvan Road and Sandhurst Drive. So the project is being progressed as part of the Transport Choices program being run by Waka Kotahi. The project is 95% funded from the Climate Emergency Response Fund, as per previous applications that have been reported to the council. So at this stage, we've completed the designs, we've sought public feedback on the proposal, and are looking to progress to construction later this year, subject to decisions today. So this report seeks approval to proceed to the next stage of implementation of the project. And I'll hand over quickly to Erica to provide a brief update from a Waka Kotahi perspective.
Welcome, Erica.
Kia ora, thank you. So what sets Transport Choices apart from other programs is really about demonstrating what can be done for communities across New Zealand to really provide viable transport choices quickly and effectively. So the Granada Street project, from a Waka Kotahi perspective, is absolutely fantastic. It embodies all the things that we are trying to achieve through the Transport Choices program. It not only delivers a great cycle network, it obviously contributes very heavily to school travel, and it also is about connecting communities. And so we are fully supportive of this project, and we've been particularly impressed by the quality of design that has come forward through the Granada Street project. We've set quite a different bar when it comes to design standards and parameters for the Transport Choices program. And we've worked really closely with TCC and colleagues to make sure that we were able to meet that high bar. And as far as we're concerned, this is a fantastic project that we are very happy to support, and we look forward to assisting TCC to take it forward to implementation.
Okay, thank you. Karen, Brendan, anything to add? Okay, questions? Shad.
Or just a couple of comments and maybe a question on the way through. I'm really supportive of what we're trying to do here. Trying to provide more active modes. I do know that there are a number of schools, on this side of Girvan Road, there's quite a large catchment. You get a whole lot of kids there that need to get to high school. We do need to provide safe access along these corridors and then through, particularly crossing Girvan and then on to the schools beyond, Links Ave, and then to the high school, intermediate, and the primary school in Arataki. So thinking about these catchments, probably the area that I'm kind of interested in is that access point across Girvan in particular. I do know that we do have a program or thinking about upgrades at that particular intersection at Marlin. I do like the connection through Arataki Park as well, providing that off-street access point. But it was raised through the Arataki Liaison Group and through Links Ave about providing safe access, particularly for kids, through this part of the network. And then also Girvan Road connecting through to Matapi and then on to out here. So how do we provide for that? And the solutions that you've put forward have been great. Picking up on the commentary in the report about the engagement and consultation, sounds like, just reading through the report and the attachment, the approach of going door to door, I think was a good idea. Actually gauging people's views and feedback on what this means for them, trying to accommodate all this within a defined carriageway, whether it's parking, cycleways. You're gonna have to compromise something to accommodate active modes. Yeah, so I suppose my question is that access point across Girvan, and then also connecting from Granada right through to crossing across to Matapi.
Through the chair, thank you very much. Yes, it has been a significant issue for the community. As part of the Transport Choices package, we have supplementary or complementary measures, which includes a signalised crossing, pedestrian cycle crossing from Arataki Park that crosses Girvan Road. The future of Marlin intersection will be considered as part of the Arataki wider business case. But provisioning that connection is quite important from a safety perspective. That in addition would provide some connection through to the new path that's been built by Wakakatai along Girvan Road from State Highway 2, Manganui, and we'll be making some signal improvements that would connect through the underpass to Matapihi. Wider area will be considered as part of the Accessible Streets program for those local connections to the wider schools.
Granada Street was always picked as part of the Area A Accessible Streets as a preferred cycle route. So this project really in advance implementation of part of that wider Area A project.
Stephen.
Yeah, happy to support the recommendations. I'm particularly pleased with reporting on the level of community engagement and consultation, including individual door knocking. These sort of projects are always challenging because there's a dilemma of meeting the needs of the local community versus meeting the needs of those who commute through that local community. And I can see reflected quite significantly in the survey results that came through, that quite a divided opinion, but notwithstanding that, the level of support for this project is very clear, and I think it's a great initiative, and even better that Waka Kotahi are funding 95% of it. Thank you. So appreciate your involvement and your commitment to the project.
And happy to second, just in doing so, in terms of this proposed development, which is parallel to what's happening on Marine Parade, and then in terms of what is envisaged, in terms of cross connections, but also linking this up with that Marine Parade and Maranui Street and the cycleway connections to Papamoa.
As part of the Accessible Streets program and what that scope entails, it's really about focusing as opposed to some of the major cycle routes, because we've got Marine Parade as well as Manganui Road, be focusing on accessibility and safety improvements, providing some of those local connections, and then working through, through to Links Ave will be all part wrapped up in that area, a Accessible Streets program.
So in terms of, we've signalled in terms of work on Ocean Beach Road, and given the significant program that this is proposing, does this provide, for example, an alternative to doing further cycleway works on Ocean Beach?
It can do. So one of the issues we've got is you've got, particularly if you look at the Papamoa Arataki area, you've got different types of users. So you've got your commuters, and this is very much designed for your commuter cyclists going to and from school, etc. Some of your cyclists along Ocean Beach Road are more out for training rides, or they're heading towards the beach. So there will always be a certain demand, but I think when we do Area A, we can look at rationalising down the number of key cycle corridors and trying to reduce that so that not every single corridor is prioritised for cycling, but we will have, say, Manganui Road, you will still have a cycle lane. It may not just be the separated form that we're putting in Granada, which is more of our major cycle facility.
Thanks, Brendan. And just checking that. I just wanted to, in picking up your point, Erica, just and your acknowledgement regarding the quality of design. So thanks for that. And in terms of the effort that's actually gone in by the team in terms of achieving what is before us today. The other thing to make by way of commentary, and picking up the point Stephen made, do love that level of funding at 95% from Waka Kotahi. Okay, any other questions from listeners? It's been moved and seconded, so it's received a report approving the scope of the Granada Street upgrade as outlined, approves the project to proceed to implementation, subject to Waka Kotahi approval of implementation funding, and delegating to the General Manager of Structure to award a construction contract up to an approved value of 6.2 million. Okay, nothing further. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. So we'll move on to the next report, which I think's on parking. Oh, where is it?
The next report is the 6-weekly traffic and bylaw updates. They are operational matters. There's nothing significant in there. These are either changes requested by members of the public or they are safety interventions. For instance, yellow lines around sort of blind corners where we've got cars parking that are obscuring vision. Happy to take any questions.
I'm happy to move it. Seconder, Shad.
I just had one quick question in the report around Tauranga Boys College and boom parking. Did that come from residents or who did that come from?
That has come from a combination of both the school, some of the residents, and just operationally, some of those booms are not in great condition just because of the parking, particularly over this last winter.
Yeah, I'm happy to second the report.
Okay.
Thank you.
Nothing further. So we're on page 169 in terms of recommendations A, to receive, and B, to adopt the proposed amendments outlined in Appendix A, etc. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Now we'll move to the 11.12, sorry, and that's the Bethlehem signalised pedestrian crossing investigation and safety review report.
Yes, so this is a follow-up after a tragic crash at that crossing about a year ago. And we were asked to look into, after a petition, if there were any options that could be implemented to make it safer. Potentially remove it altogether was one of the suggestions. And we now have a recommendation to leave it in place, but to keep working with Waka Kotahi on shorter and long-term improvements, particularly as we go through a revocation process as well, with Tauranga Northern Link being implemented, and this part of the current state highway, which will be a local road eventually, will need some significant changes to it. I would like to highlight in the recommendations that recommendation B should be changed to support the recommendation that the east pedestrian crossing is not removed rather than approve, because it's not our asset, it's not on our network, so it's actually not for us to approve. So, but we would support it and promote it with Waka Kotahi is the intent of that recommendation.
Thanks, Nick.
Got Anna and Warren here. Is there any questions or any comments from the team?
Kia ora koutou. Oh, that's loud. We have worked with Waka Kotahi on this report at each stage, and while we can recommend this, like Nick says, what we will continue to do is keep talking with them around the revocation process.
Okay, no, thank you. Brendan.
What I was going to say is, with it being state highway at the moment, unfortunately, it fulfills the function of a main movement corridor, which is not necessarily in keeping with retail either side of the road. So that is creating some of the issues. When TNL opens, it does give us this opportunity to look at changing the nature of the street, because we expect volumes to drop. So I guess the recommendations we put through are interim safety changes until we can then actually do that major change as part of the revocation process.
Okay, no, thank you. Questions? Shad.
Just a comment. In terms of the petition, I assume we're going to go back to the petitioner with the outcomes of the investigation.
I understand that Democracy Services had made them aware that paper was coming up today and they were invited, but we will re-engage with them and make them aware.
It's important because, they were the ones that, well, I can't remember the guy's name, raised it with us and we've responded. So it makes sense to tie that loop off and inform them of the outcomes.
Do that.
So coming to the recommendations on page 181, receiving the report, there's an amendment that Nick suggested be support to replace the word approve. And with recommendation C, I was going to suggest in addition to that, after the word village and adding in and report back in February 2024 on such negotiations. Given there's a list of matters there in terms of short-term safety improvements that will be subject to that. So it's just, again, like going back to Mr. Kimber, just coming back to the Commission on where that is heading in terms of those discussions and negotiations with Waka Kotahi. On that, I'm happy to move that with those suggestions. Okay, second by Stephen. There's nothing further. I'll put that. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thanks, team. So that concludes all those matters in open. And on page.
We've still got to do.
Oh, sorry, yes, back to.
But you've got something public excluded that you've got to talk about first.
Yes. Oh, well. On page 13, we will go into, so if I have someone to move and second that on page 187, moved by Shad.